Amara Adagoki stepped through the airport doors, her heart racing with excitement. She had worked tirelessly for this moment, a chance to take a brief respite, a quiet getaway to the city she'd dreamt of visiting for so long. Her mind buzzed with possibilities, with the sense of freedom that only travel could offer. Her journey was not just about escape, though. It was about growth, about finding a place where she could belong, even if only for a few days. The airport was a familiar place to her, one she had frequented on countless occasions, but this time it felt different. She was a woman on a mission, with a goal that reached far beyond the mundane. Her black leather jacket clung comfortably to her frame, and her dark eyes sparkled with quiet anticipation. Her shoes clicked against the polished floors as she made her way to the gate, her thoughts floating between the future and the past. Despite the confidence she exuded, there was an undercurrent of nervousness, something she couldn't entirely push away. Amara had worked her entire life to reach this point. She had worked to prove herself in a world that often saw her as an outsider, something she had grown accustomed to. But there were still moments, fleeting but sharp, when she felt the sting of that same old prejudice. She had learned to navigate it, learned to mask her discomfort, but it was always there, lingering like an unwelcome shadow. As she approached the gate, she caught sight of the pilot standing off to the side, chatting with a group of airline staff. He was tall, with short-cropped brown hair, and his uniform was crisp, almost as if he'd just stepped out of a magazine. His posture was rigid, almost military, and his face was set in a stern expression. Amara glanced away, not wanting to make eye contact, but he saw her anyway. There was something about the way his eyes narrowed just for a split second that made her pause. She didn't want to make assumptions, but it was a look she had seen before, the kind of gaze that was quick to judge, to assume, to dismiss. "Excuse me, miss," he called out as she approached. "Your boarding pass?" Amara looked at him, her expression unreadable, before handing it over. She could already feel the weight of his gaze on her. It wasn't the type of look that asked, "Who are you?" but rather, "What are you doing here?" Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Your seat is in the back," he said, barely glancing at the boarding pass. A flash of irritation flared in her chest, but she swallowed it down. She had long learned that confronting people like him rarely led to anything productive. Instead, she nodded, a polite smile gracing her lips as she took her ticket back from him. "Thank you," she said, keeping her voice steady. The pilot didn't respond, merely stepping aside as she passed, not offering another word. She wanted to feel something, anger, perhaps, or even the satisfaction of standing up for herself. But instead, she felt a wave of quiet disappointment. She had been expecting this. It wasn't the first time she had been treated like this, not by a long shot. It was the subtle dismissal, the way people assumed they had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. Amara could feel the eyes of the other passengers as she made her way down the aisle. She ignored them, focusing instead on the sound of her footsteps as she moved to her seat. The plane wasn't full yet, but the seats around her seemed mostly occupied by men in suits, women in business attire, people who looked like they were rushing to somewhere important. She wasn't in a rush. Her trip was more about self-reflection, about taking a moment to breathe without the weight of expectations. The next few hours passed quietly, the steady hum of the airplane engines lulling her into a sense of calm. She let herself slip into the rhythm of the flight, watching the world outside her window, clouds stretching across the sky like fields of cotton. But despite the tranquility, the memory of the pilot's cold reception lingered. The more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. She had spent so many years learning how to thrive in a world that didn't always accept her, that didn't always see her as equal. She had fought to earn her place, to carve out a space for herself in a world that made it all too easy to be invisible. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting out a slow breath. She had learned to hold her head high, to keep moving forward despite the obstacles. But there were days when it felt like the world was pushing back just a little harder. The color of her skin, her gender, her very presence, it all seemed to make some people uncomfortable. She wasn't sure what the pilot had seen when he looked at her, but it wasn't just the brief moment of coldness that bothered her. It was the assumption. She had seen it too many times before. The belief that she, as a black woman, didn't belong in spaces like this. The idea that somehow she wasn't worthy of the same respect as the others. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her thoughts. She took it out, half expecting a text from a friend, but the notification was from the airline. It simply read, "Thank you for choosing our airline. We hope you have a pleasant flight." She tucked the phone back into her pocket and let herself return to the quiet hum of the plane. The flight landed without incident, and Amara gathered her things, moving slowly, not wanting to rush through the experience. She had always been the type to savor moments, to be present. The airport was bustling with activity, people hurrying in every direction, some lost in their own world, others huddled with loved ones. She felt a brief pang of homesickness, but quickly dismissed it. The journey wasn't over yet. As she made her way through the terminal, she noticed that something was amiss. The crowd seemed to be buzzing with an energy she couldn't quite place. People were whispering, casting furtive glances in her direction. She brushed it off, focusing instead on her destination, the quiet cafe she had planned to visit for a little while. But as she passed through the crowd, a hand reached out to stop her. "Ms. Adegoke?" a voice asked, and she turned to find one of the airline's representatives standing there, holding a clipboard. "Yes," Amara replied, her eyebrows furrowing slightly. "I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience earlier today," the representative said, his tone low and apologetic. "We've just been made aware of a situation regarding your flight." Amara's stomach tightened. She had a feeling she knew what this was about. "What situation?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man glanced around, ensuring no one was listening before speaking in a hushed tone. "It's the pilot, Captain Daniels. He wasn't aware of who you were. He didn't realize you were the owner of this airline." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Amara felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted. She couldn't quite process what he was saying. She had always kept her ownership of the airline a secret, something she rarely spoke about. It wasn't something she needed to flaunt, but now hearing him say it, it felt different. It felt as if the entire world was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said slowly, the words feeling heavy in her mouth. The representative's expression softened. "Captain Daniels, well, he treated you poorly, didn't he? We've just learned that the person he dismissed earlier today is, in fact, the person whose investments have kept this airline afloat. Your contribution is invaluable to us, and we deeply regret how you were treated." Amara blinked, trying to process the information. Her mind swirled. How could the pilot have not known? How could he have treated her that way, without realizing who she was? She had never let on, had never told anyone about her ownership. She hadn't wanted to make a spectacle of it. But as the reality of the situation sank in, Amara realized that the injustice wasn't just about her. It was about the way the world treated people like her, like so many others who were quietly overlooked, quietly dismissed. And it wasn't just about the pilot. No, this was much bigger. Her phone buzzed again, and she looked down at the new message. It was from the airline's legal team. The message was short, but its meaning was clear. The pilot would face consequences for his actions. As she read the message, something inside her hardened. She couldn't let this go. It wasn't just about her. It was about proving that respect, true, unwavering respect, could never be given or taken away by anyone. It was a fight she hadn't expected, but it was one she was willing to face head on. And so, as Amara stood in the middle of the crowded terminal, she knew that her journey was just beginning. Amara's fingers tightened around her phone as she read the legal team's message again. The pilot, Captain Daniels, would be held accountable for his actions. The words seemed almost hollow to her now, as if the apology and the promise of consequences were not enough to erase the sting of what had happened. She had expected, no, hoped, that this would be a quiet trip, a chance to unwind. Instead, it had turned into something much bigger, something that, deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore. The representative from the airline, still standing before her, fidgeted nervously as if awaiting a response. Amara could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't look at him. She was lost in her thoughts, grappling with the reality of her situation. The sense of injustice she had felt earlier, the humiliation, the sting of being overlooked, was swelling inside her again, but now it was coupled with something else, a sense of purpose. "I don't need anyone's pity," she finally said, her voice low but firm. "I don't need apologies. What I need is for this to never happen again, to anyone. You're telling me that he's going to face consequences. But what about the system that allowed this to happen in the first place?" The representative's expression faltered for a moment, and Amara could see the conflict in his eyes. He clearly wasn't used to being confronted like this, not by someone who, as he had just learned, had the power to change things. But Amara wasn't interested in playing along with the status quo. "I've worked my entire life for this," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I've worked for every step I've taken, and this," she gestured to the airport around her, "this is just a reminder of how easy it is for people like me to be dismissed. It's not just Captain Daniels. It's a mindset that's ingrained in so many industries, in so many places. It's the idea that people like me don't belong, that my place in the world is somehow lesser." The representative shifted uncomfortably, his mouth opening and closing, as if unsure of what to say. He had likely never encountered a situation like this before. It wasn't every day that someone with her influence confronted the system. It wasn't every day that someone challenged the way things had always been. Amara's heart was still pounding, but she felt more alive than she had in a long time. The anger from earlier had transformed into something stronger, something with more clarity. She wasn't just reacting to the wrong done to her, she was standing up for a cause larger than herself. She looked the representative square in the eyes, her voice steady. "I need a meeting with your CEO, now." The man hesitated, but nodded. "I'll make the arrangements. I'll let you know when you can expect to meet him." Amara didn't wait for him to leave. She turned on her heel and walked through the terminal, her mind already spinning with the possibilities. The meeting with the CEO, whoever that person was, wasn't going to be just about Captain Daniels. It was going to be about changing the system, about ensuring that no one else had to experience what she had. And more importantly, it was about ensuring that the humanity in everyone, regardless of their skin color, their gender, their background, was recognized and respected in every corner of the world. The quiet cafe she had planned to visit no longer felt like the right place for her. She needed to be focused, to be deliberate in what came next. So she decided to take a walk through the city, her steps purposeful, as she navigated through the busy streets. The air was crisp, and the sun had begun to dip beneath the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the buildings. Amara breathed deeply, feeling the cool breeze on her skin as it helped clear her mind. She passed through several blocks, her mind churning with ideas and plans. She thought about the next steps, about the way she could move forward. There would be interviews undoubtedly. Media would want to get their hands on the story. But Amara wasn't interested in being a headline or a fleeting topic for public discussion. She wanted change, real, lasting change. As she walked, her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her assistant, confirming that the meeting with the CEO was set for tomorrow morning. Amara's heart skipped a beat. Tomorrow. It was happening sooner than she had expected, and part of her wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But then she remembered the fire that had ignited in her chest, the need to be heard, to be seen, and to make sure that what happened to her didn't happen to anyone else. She made her way back to her hotel and entered her room. The city outside was still alive with movement, but Amara felt like she was in her own world now. She placed her bag on the desk and sat down on the bed, her thoughts racing. The weight of the moment, of what was to come, settled on her shoulders. There was no going back now. She could have taken the path of least resistance, could have accepted the pilot's apology and moved on, but that wasn't who she was. Amara wasn't someone who accepted injustice as just a part of life. She had spent too many years fighting. To get to this point, too many years fighting for what was right, to let this go. As she sat there, her mind flitted through the possibilities. What would the CEO say? Would they take her seriously? Would they understand the depth of her frustration, of the hurt she had felt, of the years of struggle that had led her to this moment? But even if they didn't understand, she would make them listen. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let this moment slip away. She had earned her place in this world, and now it was time for everyone else to recognize that. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen. This time, it was a message from her mother. "Amara, I know you're going through a lot right now, but you've always been strong, and I'm so proud of the woman you've become. Don't let anyone take your light." Amara smiled softly, her heart swelling with gratitude. Her mother had always been her rock, always reminding her of who she was and how far she had come. Those words meant more than she could express, and they grounded her in that moment. She took a deep breath and set her phone aside. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something new. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges ahead, but Amara knew that she was ready. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been dismissed, who had ever been made to feel small. Tomorrow she would step into that meeting and demand the respect she, and everyone else, deserved. And this time, no one would be able to look the other way. The night passed slowly for Amara. The hours felt long as she lay in her hotel room, her mind buzzing with the events of the day. She couldn't help replaying the conversation with the airline representative over and over again. Every detail of Captain Daniel's actions, the way the system had failed her, seemed to haunt her thoughts. But there was a new clarity in her mind now, a conviction that was impossible to ignore. She had always known that the world was never going to hand her respect on a silver platter. She had worked for everything she had, and even then, she had often been met with resistance, with dismissive glances, and the constant need to prove herself. But now, it wasn't just about proving herself to others. It was about proving to herself that she could change the very system that had sought to keep her in the shadows. As the city outside her window twinkled with lights, Amara finally closed her eyes, trying to let sleep claim her. The uncertainty of tomorrow hung over her, but she welcomed it. She wasn't afraid anymore. If anything, the fear had melted away, replaced by a fierce determination. Tomorrow wasn't just an appointment with a CEO. Tomorrow she was standing up for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or treated unfairly. She was standing up for every person who had ever felt the sting of racism, even in its most subtle forms. The night passed, and when Amara awoke, the city was just beginning to stir. The early morning light filtered in through the blinds, casting a soft glow across the room. She stretched and stood, feeling the weight of the day ahead settle on her shoulders once more. But this time, she wasn't daunted by it. She was ready. She took a quick shower and dressed in a simple but elegant black suit, one that gave her confidence and a sense of control. There was no room for doubt in her mind anymore. Today wasn't about appearances or playing by the rules. Today it was about making sure her voice, and the voices of so many others, were heard. She checked her phone one last time, seeing another message from her mother. "Remember, Amara, sometimes the hardest battles lead to the greatest victories. Stand tall and don't let anyone silence you." Amara smiled at the words. Her mother had always known how to give her the strength she needed, even when the weight of the world felt like too much to bear. After a quick breakfast, she made her way to the corporate office building. As she entered the sleek, glass-walled lobby, she felt a brief pang of discomfort. The space felt cold, impersonal, an environment built for the powerful, the influential. But Amara had no time for discomfort today. She walked confidently toward the elevator, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors. When the elevator doors closed, she felt her pulse quicken. The meeting with the CEO was a big step. She had no idea how it would unfold or what to expect. But the thought of standing face to face with the person at the top of the hierarchy, the person who could make real change, filled her with purpose. The anger from the night before had transformed into something more productive, more focused. It wasn't rage anymore. It was a quiet strength. The elevator doors opened on the top floor, and Amara stepped into the hallway, her footsteps echoing. In the silence, she was shown into a large conference room, the walls lined with polished wood and modern art. The table in the center was enormous, capable of seating at least 10 people. A large window overlooked the city, the skyline stretching far beyond the glass, and then she saw him. The CEO of the airline, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a well-groomed beard, stood up as she entered. His suit was impeccable, and his posture radiated authority. There was something about him that immediately reminded her of the pilots. She had encountered the same air of superiority, the same unspoken expectation that the world was his to control. "Ms. Adagok," he said, his voice smooth, but with a hint of something colder behind it, "please have a seat." Amara nodded, her gaze steady. She took a seat across from him, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. The CEO's eyes flickered over her, the slightest twitch of recognition in his expression. He knew who she was, of course. "Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice," she began, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "I'm sure you've heard about the incident that took place on yesterday's flight." The CEO nodded, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Yes, of course. We've reviewed the matter thoroughly. I'm deeply sorry for how you were treated, Ms. Adagoke. That is not the standard of service we expect from our employees." Amara didn't flinch at his apology. She had heard enough empty apologies over the years to know that words meant very little without action behind them. "Apologies are not enough," she said, her voice sharp now. "Captain Daniels's behavior wasn't just about a mistake. It wasn't just about bad service. It was about a mindset that tells people like me that we don't belong, that we aren't worthy of respect." The CEO's eyes flickered briefly before he cleared his throat. "I understand your frustration, but I assure you, we'll handle the matter internally. He will be disciplined appropriately." Amara leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't just about one pilot. This is about your entire company. Your employees are a reflection of the culture you cultivate here. And if your culture allows for that kind of discrimination, then this is bigger than just Captain Daniels. This is about a systemic issue, an issue that allows people like me, like many others, to be dismissed, to be treated as less than." There was a long pause as the CEO seemed to process her words. His face remained impassive, but Amara could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had been prepared to brush this off, to move on with a simple reprimand and get back to his day. But Amara wasn't going to let him. Not this time. "You're right," he said finally, his tone softer than before. "We've let certain behaviors slide. We've allowed a certain culture to persist, and it's something we need to address. But I need to know what you're asking of me, Ms. Adagoke. What do you expect from this conversation?" Amara sat back, letting his words sink in. For the first time since entering the room, she felt a small, quiet sense of victory. He wasn't dismissing her. He wasn't brushing her off. He was listening, but this was only the beginning. "I want a full review of your company's policies," she said, her voice strong. "I want diversity and inclusion training for all of your employees, mandatory across the board. And I want accountability at every level of this organization. Not just when things go wrong, but as a daily practice. I want your company to commit to not just saying that it values diversity, but showing it in every action, in every decision." The CEO was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her. Amara could see the wheels turning in his mind, weighing the costs of such a commitment against the potential backlash. But what he didn't realize was that Amara had already made up her mind. This wasn't a negotiation. She wasn't asking for permission. She was demanding change. Finally he spoke. "It will take time, Ms. Adegoke, but I will consider your proposal. We will begin the process of restructuring our diversity initiatives immediately." Amara nodded, a quiet but satisfied smile forming on her lips. This was only the start, but it was a significant step. The battle wasn't over, and it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that change was possible. As she left the meeting, her steps were lighter, her purpose clearer. Today wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever felt invisible, who had ever been denied their place in the world. It was about proving that respect and dignity weren't privileges for the few. They were rights for all, and Amara Adegoke was going to make sure of it. The days following her meeting with the CEO were a whirlwind for Amara. She'd returned to her hotel room that afternoon, feeling both exhausted and invigorated. The CEO had made all the right promises: diversity and inclusion training for all employees, a full review of company policies, and a commitment to making real, measurable change. But Amara knew better than to take those promises at face value. Change was never simple, never easy. She had to make sure they followed through. Her phone rang the next morning, interrupting her thoughts as she sipped coffee in the hotel lobby. She glanced at the screen and smiled. It was her mother. "Amara, how did it go?" Her mother's voice was warm, filled with concern. It went, "Well," Amara replied, taking a deep breath. The CEO listened. He actually seemed to take me seriously. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then her mother chuckled softly. "Of course he did. You don't just stand in front of someone like that and not get noticed." "What's next?" Amara leaned back in her chair, staring out at the city through the wide windows. She had always loved the view from high up, how the world looked so small, so manageable. But today, the weight of what was ahead felt immense. She had made her stand, but she wasn't naive enough to think it would be easy to dismantle the old ways. Change was a long road, and she wasn't about to let up. "I'm going to hold them to their word," she said with quiet determination. "I've given them the chance to make things right. Now it's up to them to follow through." Her mother's voice softened. "I know you, Amara. You'll make sure they do." Amara smiled, feeling the strength of her mother's belief in her. "I hope so." The next few weeks were filled with meetings, phone calls, and emails. Amara kept in close contact with the airline, pushing for transparency in their actions. The CEO had assigned a diversity officer to oversee the implementation of the new initiatives, but Amara made sure to stay involved every step of the way. She wasn't just going to fade into the background. She wasn't going to let this turn into another empty promise. Her resolve was tested at every turn. There were moments when the airline seemed to drag its feet, when it felt like they were making progress, only to slide back. But Amara never wavered. She continued to meet with the CEO, with the diversity officer, with anyone who could help move the needle. She wasn't in this for the short term. She was in it for the long haul. And slowly but surely, things began to change. It started with small but meaningful shifts. Employees at all levels underwent the diversity and inclusion training, which wasn't just a lecture or a series of workshops. It was an immersive experience designed to make them confront their biases and examine their assumptions. The airline began to publish quarterly reports on its diversity efforts, showing measurable progress and setting new goals for the future. The board of directors held regular meetings on the topic, and Amara was invited to speak at several of those meetings to keep them accountable. But perhaps the most significant change came when the airline's senior leadership team began to reflect the diversity of the world around them. For the first time in the company's history, they appointed a black woman as one of their senior vice presidents. Her name was Tasha Mendez, and she had spent years in the airline industry, but had never had the opportunity to rise through the ranks. She and Amara had spoken on the phone several times, and Amara couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride when she saw Tasha standing before the media at her first press conference as an executive. She had been part of this, part of making sure that women like Tasha, who had long been overlooked, now had a seat at the table. As Amara sat in the back of the conference room watching Tasha speak, she felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. This was what it was all about. This wasn't just about one woman fighting for her place. It was about all of them. It was about creating a space where everyone could stand up, be seen, and be heard. The media coverage around Amara's involvement with the airline continued to grow, but she always made sure to deflect the spotlight. She didn't want to be celebrated for the work that was just beginning. She wanted to see it completed, to see the culture of the airline shift from one of exclusion to one of inclusion. She wanted to see people who had been made to feel small finally stand tall, to feel the respect they deserved. Months passed, and the airline's commitment to change became more than just a set of words. It became a living, breathing part of the company's identity. And though Amara was proud of the progress they had made, she knew there was still so much more work to be done. The battle for equity, for justice, for respect, it never ended. There would always be more to do, more people to reach, more systems to challenge. One crisp autumn morning, Amara sat in her office at her nonprofit organization, a cup of coffee in hand, reflecting on the journey she had been on. The airline's changes had inspired other industries to follow suit, and Amara had become a sought-after speaker at conferences, advocating for systemic change in corporate America. But as she looked out the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. She had pushed for change, but there were still so many people who were still waiting for their voices to be heard. Her phone rang again, and she picked it up without thinking. "Hello, Amara?" a familiar voice said, and she smiled as she recognized the voice of Tasha Mendez. "Hey, Tasha, how are you?" Amara asked, setting her coffee aside. "I'm good," Tasha replied, a note of excitement in her voice. "Listen, I've got some news I think you'll want to hear." Amara leaned forward, intrigued. "What's going on?" "Well," Tasha began, "the board is considering launching a new initiative, an outreach program that would work with local schools, especially in underserved communities, to expose students to careers in the airline industry. They want me to lead it, and I want you to be part of it." Amara's heart skipped a beat. She had always dreamed of seeing more people from marginalized communities take on leadership roles, and this was exactly the kind of initiative that could make that happen. "Of course I'm in," Amara replied, her voice filled with conviction. "This is exactly the kind of work we need to do. Let's make sure the next generation sees that they can have a seat at the table." The conversation continued, and they made plans to meet in person to discuss the details. As Amara hung up the phone, a sense of pride and fulfillment washed over her. The work was far from over, but it was moving forward, and she was moving it forward. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her mother. "You've done good, my girl. So proud of you." Amara smiled, her heart full. This was what it was all about, the change she had fought for, the lives she had touched, the people who were finally being seen for who they truly were. She glanced out the window again, watching. The world moved beneath her and felt the weight of her journey, but there was no regret, only a deep, quiet knowing that she had done something that mattered, something that would last, and that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all.